Sadly, today you are stuck with me on the rotation of teachers. It's terrible, isn't it? Man, the other guys are so much better. As I said last week about Mike Stallin's preaching the week before, I hope you see how great it is that we have so many men who will stand up and teach in this church. That's an incredible blessing and gift. Hasn't always been the case and is not the case in the church at large in these United States. So we are grateful for these guys who will do this and are competent in doing so. It's nice to have guys like that around. So last week, I won't say we because I wasn't in here because I'm only once a month on the rotation now. You talked about the final plague that brought the Egyptians to their knees, the death of the firstborn. And God continues to work to fulfill his promises that he had made long before. And today we're going to see as Israel finally leaves their captivity under the leadership of Moses and God's powerful hand. We've seen this promise that God has made originally to Abraham that deals with a land, a seed, and a nation. That this is what God is up to and that he's doing. We've tracked it really since Genesis 12. Here's an example of one of the passages, Genesis 15, verse 12. Now it happened that when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram. Behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. Then God said to Abraham, know for certain that your seed will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. But I will also judge the nation to whom they are enslaved, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, and you'll be buried at a good old age. Then in the fourth generation they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. So God makes this promise. They're going to go. This is what's going to happen. Your seed, they're going to come back into this land, and through them, I will build this nation. So hundreds of years in advance, we already have a prophecy of what's going to happen with Moses and in Egypt and all the stuff regarding the slavery. And in the details that we have for the Passover feast that point us to the life and the death of Jesus, it's all foreshadowed from the unblemished lamb, the blood that marks them in their houses, even the unbroken bones of the lamb that Psalm 22 will pick up on and say not one of his bones will be broken. We recognize that all that Jesus did on our behalf through his life and death, we see all this in the Old Testament in shadow form, all pointing us forward to what's going to come in its fulfillment in Christ. And then the New Testament writers pick up on all of those details to show us this is how for thousands of years God has been putting all of this together, confirming Jesus really is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, as John the Baptist declared in John chapter 3. So even in the pages of the Old Testament, we talk about that a little bit in the sermon today, even in the pages of the Old Testament, you will find Christ absolutely everywhere. Because all of it is ultimately pointing to him. So today we're going to spend our time seeing how God fulfills that final promise and brings about that final judgment on Egypt, which was all in Genesis 15 that we just read, providing this miraculous escape from their desperate situation in slavery. So our key idea today is that God provides for his people in these amazing ways that no one could plan for, no one knows is coming, but we look back with in awe. So we're going to pick up the account. Exodus chapter 12 is where we're going to start. We're going to pick up the account during the night and the early morning hours after the final plague of the death of the firstborn. Here's what happens. Exodus chapter 12, verse 31. Then he called for Moses and Aaron at night and said, rise up and get out from among my people, both you and the sons of Israel, and go serve Yahweh as you have spoken. Take both your flocks and your herds as you have spoken, and go and bless me also. And the Egyptians strongly pressed the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we'll all be dead. So the people took up their dough before it was leavened with their kneading bowls bound up in their clothes on their shoulders. Now the sons of Israel had done according to the word of Moses. They had asked from the Egyptians for articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing. And Yahweh had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have what they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. And the sons of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, aside from the little ones. A foreign multitude also went up with them, along with flocks and herds, a very large number of livestock. And they baked the dough which they had brought out of Egypt into cakes of unleavened bread. For it had not become leavened since they were driven out of Egypt and could not delay, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. Now the time that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. And it happened at the end of 430 years, to the very day that all the hosts of Yahweh went out from the land of Egypt. It is a night to be kept for Yahweh, for having brought them out from the land of Egypt. This night is for Yahweh to be kept by all the sons of Israel throughout their generations. So let's walk through the text. This is what we do. We read a text, we'll walk through and ask some questions about it, and then draw some conclusions here. So what did all of the Israelites take with them as they leave Egypt? Anything they wanted. That's a good way to sum it up. They took anything they wanted. Yes. We'll start with the bread. They take dough that didn't even have time to rise because God had instructed them. Get ready. Gird up your loins. Be prepared. So feet ready to go. Shoes on. You're going to get out of here as soon as I tell you to go. The kneading bowls they're carrying out on their shoulders, the clothes that they have, and then they have all this wealth from Egypt. Just incredible that God does this. How is it that the Israelites found favor in the eyes of the Egyptians? What does it say?
They discovered who's in charge.
They did. I would imagine after personally witnessing the 10 plagues, and certainly the final one with the death of the firstborn, they have realized that their false gods are powerless, and Yahweh is not to be trifled with. Yeah, but there's an explicit line in the text. How did they find favor with the Egyptians? God did it. God gave them favor with this pagan nation. And again, let's be reminded, Egypt isn't a God-honoring nation. They are as pagan as you'll find. They are as idolatrous as you'll find. They worship anything and everything. And the Israelites are slaves. So they're not liked. They're slaves. They're just the workforce. Especially now on the other side of this, their firstborns haven't been killed. The plagues didn't affect them. God had protected them from all of that. So now there certainly could be this bitterness and resentment, but God does this great thing by granting them favor, however it is that he does that, and they ask for their wealth. Give us your silver and gold. And Egypt says, okay. And they just turn it over like it's nothing. Again, be reminded that the gold and the silver and all that is not like what we have today. Today, if you've got expensive, fancy jewelry, it is a sign of your wealth. For them, it is their wealth. That's their money. It comes in the form of silver and gold. They wear it on them. That's why they had nose rings and the bracelets and the necklaces and all of that. That's why they had stuff on their horses and camels. It's their wealth in physical form. And they turn over the nation's wealth to the slaves and sends them out. So you've got now this next season that's going to happen for Israel in the desert that goes a lot longer than they intended it to go for the next 40 years. They're going to build out there the tabernacle that's coming, where God is going to come and dwell. Where do they get all the stuff for that? Egypt gave it to them. This is Egyptian gold. This is Egyptian silver. This is Egyptian cloth. All of that now becomes Israel. So not only has God absolutely crushed Egypt, he took all their stuff, just adding insult to injury. Now the nation is in utter poverty because Israel has all of their stuff out in the wilderness. Now notice the text, though, besides the men who left Egypt, who all's going together?
Men, women, children.
Yeah, so 600,000 men, not to mention the little ones. So some scholars would estimate 2 million 2.5 million Israelites. So they've been fertile in Egypt. 70 came into Egypt, and a couple million leave. So they've been busy out in Goshen, not just shepherding the flocks. They've been having babies and raising children, and now there is this giant nation of people who are walking out into the wilderness, which is why God has to miraculously feed them. There's nowhere that can sustain them. Yes, ma'am. Did you have your hand up?
In verse 38, I don't have the LSD, but
Well, sinner.
Egyptians also?
Yes. Yeah, so that's the next part. So it's not just their families and the women and the children go, a bunch of Egyptians go with them. Now, why is that? Comes back to what you just said. They figured out who was in charge. So they unite with Israel because Israel's God has just crushed theirs. So their gods are now worthless and powerless. And when you see a real God protecting his people like he's done in Egypt, that's a God you want to follow. You want to be a part of this people because that doesn't happen outside of Israel. Only the Israelites get that. So they leave Egypt and join into the nation of Israel. Now it will happen some more. In fact, it will come up when we talk about some of this stuff at Christmas as well. Rahab will leave Jericho, and she and her family will join the nation of Israel, and she'll get married and she'll have children. And one of her male heirs will marry a woman named Ruth, and they will give birth for a couple generations to King David. It's incredible. Pagans, outsiders, come into the nation of Israel, and through them, the lineage of Christ will come. It begins here with Egypt, as they see, wow, that's what I want to be a part of, which is the whole goal of the New Testament church, is it not? So you remember these commands from Jesus to love one another. They'll know that you're my disciples, that you have love one for another. Why is it that Christians are to be so known for their love for one another? It's because the world at large will look at it and go, man, they live way better than we do. That's a better way to go. Their God is powerful because look at what he can do. We talked about unity today in the sermon, and Psalm 133 to open the service. Only God, a powerful, miraculous God, can accomplish that kind of thing. And that is a powerful witness to the world. As a divided world looks at a unified people of God, we're not like them. We don't function like them. Our relationships are different and better than theirs are. So it's amazing how that works. That's how evangelism happens passively. It's not just active as we share our faith because we're commanded to do that. It happens passively as our light shines in the darkness. People are attracted to the light. That's just how it works. So this is why how we live together as God's people matters. So they all leave together, Israel and Egypt, with all of Egypt's money. Again, only God could do something like that. God has brought his plan all the way to fruition. They're free to leave. And finally, you heard Pharaoh say multiple times, you can leave. No, you can't. You can leave. No, you can't. As he hardens and God hardens his heart variously to where it doesn't happen. And now they're freed from this slavery, and they have this night of this solemn celebration that the Lord has released them. We still do that same celebration today through a little piece of bread and a cup of juice. And we are reminded of the salvation God has provided in the sacrifice of the firstborn, capital F, the Christ who has come to save his people and set them free. We'll talk about him a little bit here at the end as well. So in the section that follows, Moses reminds God's people over and over and over again how the Lord has delivered them and how they're to use this event as a memorial to teach their children about God's deliverance into the promised land. In chapter 13, verse 9, verse 14, verse 16, Moses reminds them, you've been freed by the strong hand of Yahweh. He did this. This isn't because Pharaoh had a change of heart. It's because God crushed Pharaoh. It's not because Egypt is nice. It's because God crushed Egypt. That's why he did this. And now, as he's been faithful to his promises, Moses calls on them to now be faithful to the Lord and to faithfully remind their children of all that God has done, because once this generation is gone and a new generation arises, what we will see is the complete unfaithfulness to the Lord that occurs because of that. They do not do a good job of their faithfulness here. It happens multiple times. We've already seen it happen with Joseph. When Joseph dies, Pharaoh doesn't know anything what's happening, and disaster strikes. It will happen at the end. This generation will die off in the wilderness. They'll get into the promised land, and almost on day one, they're idolatrous again. They're unfaithful to the Lord. Because this generation that saw God work is no longer around. And they don't personally experience these plagues. Everything has changed. You get into the book of Judges, and Joshua is now dead. They've come into the promised land, and it says the generation has died who knew nothing of all that God had done, of getting them into the promised land, because they weren't faithful in telling them. And boy, when you read Judges, they certainly were not faithful to the Lord, just up and down and up and down and up and down, over and over and over again, how terrible it will work. David's faithful. Solomon is sort of. Rehoboam divides the kingdom because it's not faithful from generation to generation to generation. So this is why it's so critically important we pass on the faith to the next generation. In fact, if you walk right out these doors and turn and look at this wall, on the outside of that wall, you will see the original charter of this church, signed by the original people on the day that this church was founded, and surrounding it is a verse from Psalms about we will pass on the faith to the next generation, because they have started this, and it's our job to uphold it and to pass it on to the next generation, because they really blow it here. Now, the next text we're going to read is probably one of the most well-known passages in all the Bible, and rightly so. And this is one of our challenges for those who've been around the church for a while and are relatively familiar with the Bible. It's challenging to read familiar Bible passages without inserting in all the things you already know and all of the biases you already have and the interpretations you already believe to be true. And you're not reading the text for what it says. So be mindful of that as we read into this, all that God has done. So chapter 13, starting in verse 17, and we're going to read the whole next section of what God does, because it's incredible. 13, verse 17. Now it happened that when Pharaoh had let the people go, God did not guide them by the way of the land of the Philistines, even though it was near. For God said, lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. Hence God turned the people to the way of the wilderness, to the Red Sea, and the sons of Israel went up in battle array from the land of Egypt. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, God will surely take care of you, and you shall bring up my bones from here with you. Then they set out from Succoth and camped at Etham on the edge of the wilderness. And Yahweh was going before them in a pillar of cloud by day to guide them on the way, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light, that they may go by day and by night. He did not take away the pillar of cloud by day, nor the pillar of fire by night from before the people. Now Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the sons of Israel, so that they turn back and camp before Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. You shall camp in the front of Baal-zephon, opposite it by the sea. And Pharaoh will say of the sons of Israel, they are wandering in confusion in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. Thus I will harden Pharaoh's heart with strength, and he will pursue them. And I will be glorified through Pharaoh and all his army, so that the Egyptians will know that I am Yahweh, and they did so. And the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, and the heart of Pharaoh and his servants was changed toward the people, and they said, what is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us? So he made his chariot ready and took his people with him. He took 600 choice chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt, and with officers over all of them. And Yahweh hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, with strength. And he pursued the sons of Israel as the sons of Israel were going out with an exalted hand. Then the Egyptians pursued them with all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, his horsemen and his army, and they overtook them camping by the sea beside Pi-hahiroth in front of Baal-zephon. Now Pharaoh grew near, And the sons of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they became very afraid. So the sons of Israel cried out to Yahweh. And then they said to Moses, is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you've taken us away to die in the wilderness? What is this you've done against us in bringing us out of Egypt? We'll talk about that goofiness in a minute. Is this not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than for us to die in the wilderness. Moses said to the people, do not fear. Stand by and see the salvation of Yahweh, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you have seen today, you will never see them again forever. Yahweh will fight for you, and you will keep silent. Then Yahweh said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Speak to the sons of Israel so that they go forward. As for you, raise up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and split it, and the sons of Israel shall go through the midst of the sea on dry land. As for me, behold, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians with strength, so that they will go in after them, and I will be glorified through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. Then the Egyptians will know that I am Yahweh, when I am glorified through Pharaoh, through his chariots and his horsemen. And the angel of God who had been going before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them. So it came between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel. And there was a cloud along with the darkness, yet it gave light at night. Thus the one did not come near the other all night. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. And Yahweh swept the sea back by the strong east wind all night and made the sea into dry ground, so the waters were split. So the sons of Israel went through the midst of the sea on dry land, and the waters were a wall to them on the right hand and on their left. And then the Egyptians pursued them. And all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen went in after them into the midst of the sea. And at the morning watch, Yahweh looked down on the camp of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud and brought the camp of the Egyptians into confusion. And he caused their chariot wheels to swerve, and he made them drive with difficulty. So the Egyptians said, let us flee from Israel, for Yahweh is fighting for them against the Egyptians. Then Yahweh said to Moses, stretch your hand over the sea so that the waters may come back over the Egyptians, over their chariots and their horsemen. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal state at daybreak while the Egyptians were fleeing right into it. Then Yahweh overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. And the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen, even Pharaoh's entire army that had gone into the sea after them. Not even one of them remained. But the sons of Israel walked on dry land through the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on the left. Thus Yahweh saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. And then Israel saw the great hand which Yahweh had used against the Egyptians, and the people feared Yahweh, and they believed in Yahweh and in his servant Moses. Wow. If you were at the movie night last Sunday night and the 10 Plague Buffet, you got to see this in cartoon form. Still brilliant. The movie has aged quite well, even though it's cartoon, but nothing could do this justice of the amazing miracle this truly is, of all that God does in the midst of their slavery, fleeing for freedom. So let's ask a few questions and then pull out some things that were quite explicit in the text. How does God lead his people through all of this? It's got the cloud, a pillar of fire, so they can move day or night, so he provides them exactly what they need. And when Egypt comes, it moves to their back and guards them now. It's not guiding them anymore because all they have to do is walk forward through the water. But in the back, it's now protecting as the rear guard. Did you notice the seemingly throwaway line? Who's the cloud and the fire? The angel of the Lord. Yeah, so this is the embodied form of the angel of the Lord, who will come up multiple times throughout the Old Testament, and most conservative scholars would say that is Jesus in physical form, the commander of the Lord's armies, the one who will represent the Lord in all of that. And even when many will speak to the angel of the Lord, they will switch and start referring to him as Yahweh, because this is God in physical form. And we know who that is. His name is Jesus. So this is a physical form of the angel of the Lord protecting them, guiding them, doing all that he does. What is God's ultimate purpose in this? He's going to cause this to happen, and God's in charge of it. From like every detail of the whole thing. Notice how much God is in charge of making it happen this specific way. This is not by chance. This is not by accident. God is ensuring this exact thing happens. For what purpose? For his glory. So he'll be glorified through Pharaoh by his death, by the death of the Egyptian army, so that Egypt will know that I am Yahweh. So the whole nation, which Egypt runs the world at this point in human history. So Egypt and thus the world will know the God of Israel is the one true God. Because look at what he just did. Ra can't do this. No other Egyptian god can do this. Only Yahweh could pull off something like this. Because you could ask, why in the world would Egypt, standing on the bank on their side, on the west side of the water, it's parted. I imagine that was an overwhelming moment when they came onto the horizon and saw that. And Israel is escaping through it on dry ground. Again, we dare not skip over that. That's a pretty cool miracle. It's not even muddy. It's dry ground. It's muddy when Egypt is on it. It's dry when Israel's on it. I love how God does that kind of stuff. And instead of stopping and going, I'm going home. This is nuts. I'm going home. They pursue. Yes, sir.
God kind of condemns Moses for crying out and
Yeah.
asking for instructions.
Mm-hmm.
What was Moses' other option?
So we don't know if God has already told Moses to do something, and Moses is ignoring that, or if it's you should know, just walk to the water and strike it, and this is what's going to happen.
But he in turn says, pick up your staff.
Mm-hmm. Go and do this.
How did Moses know to do that without God telling him?
Maybe he told him before. We don't know. We don't know. I appreciate what are you crying to me for? Like, look at what I've done. You know, so do you not think that I can do something with this water? For crying out loud. Stop being a big baby. That's my interpretation. Stop being a big baby, Moses. Just go to the water and we'll just call this a day. That after all that you've seen that I've done, you should know I can do this too. This little body of water is nothing to me. And he blows this wind and all of a sudden it's dry. So I wouldn't necessarily call it a condemnation of Moses, but hey, come on. Why are you afraid of what's currently happening?
Well, Jesus did the same thing with the disciples. Ye of little faith.
Yeah, come on, guys. They think they're going to drown. Jesus is in the boat. For crying out loud, guys, do you think we're all going to die today? Yeah, no. I breathed all this into existence. So I can stop a little storm. And he does. He rebukes the storm, which is super cool. I don't even know how you do that, but I would love to be able to do that. Peace be still.
I think it's good that you can.
Yeah, probably. Let's be honest, Gene. I would totally abuse that power. There is no way I would handle that well. It would be epic for me and misery for everyone else. But it would be cool for a while. I would love that. And again, you got to love that Jesus does this kind of stuff to show all of this. Who is it that has power over nature, over the water, and all of this? And remember, they've just woken Jesus up from a dead sleep in the back of the boat. How are you when you get woken up in the middle of the night in a dead sleep by one of your children? Are you happy? No. You're ready to murder. It's not going well for you. So this is Jesus' moment. He's fully human, so let's acknowledge that. And they wake him up, you of little faith, and he turns to the storm. Be quiet, be still. That's not how he said it. It's like, shut up, I'm going to bed. And then he goes back to bed, and everything's calm. That's what's happening here. Come on, Moses, you know that I can do this. After all that I've done, this is not what's going to stand in the way. And there Egypt is. standing at the edge of this water, I'd go home, so would you. There is no way we're going to mess with that because they already know Israel's God is protecting them and doing all of this. And they pursue anyway. Why? Because God hardened their hearts. That's why. They pursued into the water because God ensured they would pursue into the water.
And he was keeping his promise.
He said he would obliterate them. This is how he does it. He kills their entire army. So after this, the global superpower, they have nothing. The army's dead. So God purposely does this to get them into the water, and then God kills them. Now, this is typically things that are not flannel graphed in Sunday school for little kids. And there are passages in the Old Testament, we'll continue to see many of them once we get certainly into kicking out the Canaanites out of the Promised Land and all of that, where there's necessarily, maybe this part of us that would cringe at what we read or would feel the need to defend what God is doing or even dismiss what it says. God explicitly did this so that he could kill all of them. That is the God that you worship. That is the God that you serve. You don't get to ignore that. We don't get to dismiss that from the text. Maybe on their own they wouldn't have followed. God ensured that they did so that he could kill them all. Because that is the condemnation on Egypt and their gods. This is how explicit God is to ensure the world knows I'm it. Yes, sir.
Okay, that's kind of morbid. So
It is a bit morbid, isn't it?
let's go on from there. What's the likelihood that one of the Israelite families did not celebrate Passover? And is there any reference to that?
No.
But two people, right? It's pretty impossible.
Yeah, it's certainly the case. Now, what helps is they all live together in the same region.
And 9 plagues before.
Yes, they've witnessed all this. His question was, would it be possible that an Israelite family had not celebrated the Passover? So there's no record of any of that, but here's what we do know. Any house that wasn't marked with the blood of the lamb, firstborn died. That's what we do know. So if for whatever reason they decided not to participate in that, their firstborn died. That's what would have gone down, because the only protection from that, the destroyer of the firstborn, Hebrews 12 calls him. Again, that's not a name of God you typically find on a poster in a Bible bookstore, but destroyer of the firstborn. The only protection from that was the blood of the Lamb.
And then my other question is, multi-generation families, right? Because this is that time period. So is
Yep.
it every firstborn? So like if the dad was still alive,
Yeah, so it's not just the firstborn of the youngest generation. So it's not just kids who are dying. It's adults. It's old men. Yeah, it's the firstborns. And this is an overwhelming defeat. A cry will arise in Egypt that has never been heard nor will be heard again. So you've got multiple generations, firstborns dying, which is why this is finally the plague where Pharaoh says, it's time to go. Everybody get out. Yes, ma'am.
Would it have been just the men, or is it the firstborn, the daughter of the Israelites?
It doesn't necessarily say men explicitly, no. The right of the firstborn was a male right. My assumption would be that it would be male because when you are cutting out the firstborn, you're cutting out generations. That only would happen if you kill the firstborn males. It doesn't happen if you kill the females. So it is a condemnation on multiple generations that there is no heritage for you from this point on because there's no one even to give your inheritance to, even if you had any left because Israel took it all. Yeah.
Wouldn't Pharaoh have been the firstborn in his line?
Not necessarily. Would Pharaoh have been the firstborn? Not necessarily. And certainly wouldn't have been because he didn't die.
Right.
So that wasn't always the case where the firstborn gets that. It could be anybody. Sometimes pharaohs didn't have children, and their adopted children become pharaoh. Yeah. So those things happen. Yeah. Could have been a daughter. We don't know. But because he survives this, it wouldn't have been him. Yeah. 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 Yeah, and he would have been adopted because he wasn't the child of Pharaoh, for sure. Yeah, sort of a fabrication of the movie for dramatic effect, but he did grow up in the court of Pharaoh. So this is why God calls Moses to go to Pharaoh, because Pharaoh knows Moses. So there's a previous relationship there. So God has set up the death of Israelite children under Pharaoh, the miraculous saving of Moses, the basket of reeds. The word that the Hebrew uses is the same word for ark from Genesis 6 for Noah and the ark. So he's put in a little ark, and he survives being on the Nile. He's raised in Pharaoh's own household. So there is some sort of a relationship there. We don't know, are they friends? How much do they interact? We have no knowledge of any of that at all. Yes? That's a great question. These Egyptians who just lost a firstborn, do they grow bitter against Yahweh because he just took the life of their firstborn? Or do they convert? Because ultimately this is because of the falsehood of their gods. And this is the punishment of the one true God on the pagan nation. No idea. So the issue still happens today, right? So when tragedy strikes, the death of a child is certainly going to likely top that list, or the death of a spouse, or a debilitating illness, whatever it might be. When tragedy strikes, people go one of two directions. One is they'll grow bitter, and they'll get angry at God, and how could he do this? There's an assumption that God is sovereign over all this, that God would either cause this or allow it to happen, which is a good assumption. Or many of them, because of the difficulty of that, they will convert, and they will draw closer to God through that darkness and through that suffering and become believers because of it. And that is dependent on what the Lord is doing in the heart, because our emotions aren't going to dictate one way or the other. Yeah. Yeah. At the time, nobody feels that way, but over time, we begin to see that, and that's one of the glories of eternity, is we get to look back and see all that the Lord did, even through this suffering. I mean, the cross of Jesus being the prime example, right? This is the greatest injustice in the history of the world, and yet, this is what the Lord did through all of it. Yes?
Is God's condemnation on Egypt directly related back to Ham's curse from Noah?
Oh, look at you putting Bible verses together. It certainly can be, because what we will continue finding out is God will do these things based on words that he spoke centuries before, that they will now come to fruition. In my Bible reading right now, I'm in 2 Kings, and you see these wicked kings rise and fall in Israel, and you've got Judah that's mostly good, but then there's some bad ones and all of that. And Jehu becomes king. He's my favorite Old Testament king. I mean, King David's pretty great, but Jehu's the man, because he is the one who eradicates Ahab's family from the land. Ahab and Jezebel, that famous, terrible family, and their children marry into the next line of kings. So Ahab and Jezebel and their wickedness influence Israel for generations. God makes Jehu king. Jehu sets up traps for all of their families and kills them all. To eradicate them, he sends letters to the families that are raising Ahab's 70 children and said, here's what I want you to do. And they go, no, we don't want to do that. What would you like for us to do? He said, send the heads of all 70 children to me. And they do. And it cuts off his line. And he says, my father worshipped Baal a little bit, which is quite an understatement because it wasn't a little bit. He goes, I will worship him much. Get everybody in the country who worships Baal together, and we're going to have this solemn assembly, and anybody who doesn't come, I'm going to kill him. Well, They show up. Everybody who worships Baal shows up, and at that celebration, Jehu has every one of them killed to eradicate Baal worship from the land of Israel. I mean, that's just awesome to do all that. Like, one king did all of this, and there's this throwaway line about Jehu, because that's when Jezebel dies, and she's thrown down, and the dogs eat her, and it just her skull and hands and feet are left. I mean, it's very graphic. Again, not flannel graphed in Sunday school. A very bloody sort of event. And there's this throwaway line that all this happened because God said this to this person, and it's been centuries. And all this happens down the road later because God is faithful to his word. And he said this whole line's going to be cut off. And he cuts them off. It's amazing. This is what God is up to. Not just his big plan in the world that, oh yeah, God has set 3 or 4, directional things to happen, and they're going to go down. God leaves nothing to chance. Nothing. Every single person, every single reaction, every single event, every single king. Think of the intricacies of that. The genetics alone are mind-boggling of what God has to do to ensure this king will come on this day and he will do these things. Think of all the generations that he had to ensure got married and had children, got married and had children, got married and had children. God is doing all of that to ensure that at this moment, he's now going to get this done. Every single moment of every single generation is controlled by the hand of a sovereign God who's ensuring that what he wants done absolutely will get done. Nothing is left open for chance. This is the God we serve. This is the God we worship, who in the fullness of time, the Lord Jesus was born. That is not a throwaway line. Millennia of God orchestrating. In the fullness of time, the Lord Jesus is born so that he would accomplish the work that he accomplished. When he did it, where he did it, for whom he did it, all designed from the foundation of the world, Ephesians chapter 1. Absolutely incredible. So, we'll pick up there next week. 1, 2, 3, go team.